This is a map of New York City's population density. As you can see here, Manhattan is the densest part of the city. That makes sense as Manhattan was, and still is, the center of New York. With the average density of Manhattan being 72,000 people per square mile, it is among the most densely populated areas in the world. But what also is interesting is how much of that density drops off after you exit the island and into other boroughs. Sure, the West Bronx can be just as densely populated as Manhattan. But go to the east and the density drops off significantly. Brooklyn's closest neighborhoods to Manhattan can be half or even a third of the density of Manhattan neighborhoods just across the East River. Queens is even more dramatic, as outside a few dense pockets in Jackson Heights, Corona, and Flushing, all of the other neighborhoods can be a quarter or less dense as Manhattan. And Staten Island? Forget about it. This is why, according to a recent study, 92% of all outer borough buildings within 1 kilometer of a subway stop are zoned for only 3 stories or less. This severely limits the usefulness of the subways here, as subways are known for transporting a ton of people. But without the density needed to support it, we are basically running underfull trains at a massive cost. Not exactly an efficient use of funds. But where exactly should we upzone? In this video, we will examine where the New York City subway is the least crowded to determine where it is the best place to upzone. So, I was inspired to make this video after reading David Oakey's article on housing. He basically outlines how much untapped potential there is in New York City. And in order to gain a fuller picture of that potential, I sat down with David for an interview.
My name is David. I'm a second year at Macaulay Honors College. I wanted to produce some kind of database look at what the housing situation is. I was inspired by an article by fellow planner and author Vishant Chakrabarty talking about how we can fit an extra 1 million homes, or at least extra homes for 1 million New Yorkers in the city based on vacant lots.
I also interviewed Professor Jason Barr, who authored that aforementioned study that determined that the vast majority of outer borough buildings are zoned for low density.
My name is Jason Barr. I'm a professor of economics at Rutgers University, Newark, in New Jersey. And so my research areas are in real estate economics, urban economics, and I'm very interested in New York City housing. Given the housing crisis, the question is, what can the city be doing to add more housing?
Let's back up for a second and explain why we should upzone. New York City is currently facing a housing shortage, and almost all experts agree that we need more housing in order to bring down rents. It's a supply and demand issue. People want to come to New York and work here, which is why it is so expensive to do so. And YIMBY policies have been implemented throughout the US and the world, and have often seen great success. However, getting our housing production back to the levels of the 1920s is going to be an extreme undertaking, though no less necessary. Just like the subways, we also forgot how to build homes cheaply and effectively. We also forgot how to build housing holistically in order to make sure that the existing facilities, such as electrical, sewage, water, and transit lines, can take an increase in population.
I think the MTA needs to work with city planning, needs to work with schools. They should have a parks. Think about this from a holistic point of view, that you should be upzoning for capacity, but you should also be planning for improvements in transportation and mass transit access. We need to be thinking about housing, and the way to solve the housing affordability crisis is to focus building that housing near the transit lines, because you build apartment buildings there. Apartment buildings are smaller, they're a little bit more affordable. And they can also help increase the vacancy rate, which would help moderate prices.
Therefore, this video will be an attempt towards that holistic angle of housing. And what better way to start than mapping New York City's subway capacity in order to see where we can build the most housing. Prior to the pandemic, the New York City subway is noted for being overcrowded. For example, the L train was operating at 98% capacity once trains left Bedford Avenue. The 4 and 5 trains were operating at 105% capacity once trains left 86th Street. The E achieved 104% capacity at Roosevelt Avenue. So one may say that New York City is at capacity and we can't take any more people. Well, that is incorrect for 3 reasons. The first is that this is from 2014. 10 years later, due to the pandemic, ridership is a third lower. While it has been going back up, it will probably take another decade before things get back to those 2014 levels. Second, we should note where trains reach capacity. Most lines in New York City are radial, where riders slowly fill up the train until the line reaches the city center. This is where the riders get off to their jobs or transfer onto another train. So, the most crowded that the train will be is usually right before or after Midtown Manhattan. This usually means that upzoning anywhere in Midtown Manhattan is fair game, as subway capacity there is increasing, not decreasing. Third, even during the peak ridership era of the 2010s, there are still areas in the outer boroughs that are still underfull. That includes the A, C, and F trains in Brooklyn, and a 1 train in the Bronx, to name a few. Therefore, there is a lot of capacity to spare in a New York City subway, and we will focus our efforts to upzone there, not only to give New York City its much needed housing, but also just to fill up the train. The Queens Boulevard line, or QBL for short, is known for being extremely crowded. After all, it is just one of only 2.5 subway lines in Queens. When you have 2.4 million people in Queens and only 2.5 subway lines, expect the trains to be extremely crowded. That is the case for the express lines on QBL. But what about the locals? Well, it depends. The stations between Elmhurst and 67th Avenue are well used, and the locals mainly act as shuttles to the next express station. But what about 36th to 65th Street? After all, this is the last group of stations that the express skips, which means there is no need for riders to transfer to the next express train. This means upzoning these stations won't spill over to the overcrowded E and F trains. However, with the exception of Steinway Street, these stations are vastly underutilized. This makes it the opportune place to upzone. Let's start with what was proposed: Sunnyside Yards. A while back, there was a plan to transform the yard into a mixed-use district, akin to Hudson Yards. And there would be 12,000 apartment units added here, meaning about 45,000 residents can live here. All of this would be affordable, which is good. Meanwhile, the surrounding station that would serve this, 36th Street, currently sees about 2,600 riders daily. That is unbelievably low, especially when it is so close to Manhattan. However, add 45,000 people and the ridership will swell to 47,600 daily riders. This will make 36th Street not only the most used station outside of Manhattan, but also the 8th overall. Now, not everyone at Sunnyside Yard would use the New York City subway, but if 43% of people did, that would still add around 19,000 riders, for a total of 21,000 daily riders at 36th Street. And for those 21,000 daily riders, not everyone would be there at the exact same time. Some might be the typical 9-to-5 commuter, others might have a night job, or are commuting to see friends in the evening. This is why peak ridership per hour is usually around 10% of total daily ridership. This means that at most, this new development would add 2,100 riders per hour to the M and R trains. And at around 18 M and R trains, this new development would represent just 5% capacity to the overall capacity of QBL local. Clearly, we can do more. 2 stations down, we get to 46th Street. Just south of here is probably the worst urbanism New York City can offer: the Sunnyside parking lots. These parking lots span 600,000 square feet, making an opportune place to build new high-rises.
So I think a better model might be like a battery park city where you kind of have a mix of different building types, high rises, medium rises, some office areas, and then, open space.
While I think we should be moving away from parking lots, and I will opt to eliminate like half of them, I do recognize that some small businesses like the Home Depot and the car dealerships nearby would need some parking. Therefore, we will preserve some parking by building raised buildings. These raised buildings would preserve the parking on the ground floor while also having density above. Anyway, with a benchmark of 30-story buildings, we can fit 7,000 apartments and about 26,000 people here. And again, using the exact same statistics that we used before, the total ridership of 46th Street will be 16,500 riders. At most, this new development would add 1,650 people per hour, which would only represent 4% of the capacity that the M and R trains currently provide. Now, zooming outside of the Sunnyside area, there are other parking lots we can upzone, especially near the Northern Boulevard station. The intersection of Broadway and Northern Boulevard can definitely use some mid or high rises, as most of this busy intersection is just two giant roads plus parking lots. Since there are a ton of car dealerships in the area, I do think raised buildings work best to preserve those lots. A solution could be put into place, where the ground floor would be the offices and the parking lots of the car dealerships, and then anything above would be new housing. I think this is a compromise that would make most people happy. Another place in Queens that is ripe for development is here, Aqueduct. There is a ton of parking lots here, and combined with extremely low ridership in the area, this makes it another opportune place to upzone.
We have a horse racing ring with like a ton of parking next to it. It could be rezoned. It could be redeveloped for I'm guessing like hundreds or thousands of people to live in. And you still have transit nearby, and that transit is primarily underused at the moment.
If you thought the Sunnyside parking lots are huge, then you have not seen the footprint that the Aqueduct parking lots take up. The Aqueduct parking lots are more than 5 times the size at Sunnyside, at 2.7 million square feet. What is worse is that they are usually empty, as seen here, which means that we can definitely take some of these parking lots away for housing. The rest of the parking lots would be preserved, but we'll have developments on top of them in the form of raised buildings, which is the same concept we used at Sunnyside. However, before we add our usual housing, we do have to be careful.
You don't want to kind of overdo it. I mean, you want to find this right balance between, sort of like, let's say, medium rise housing, maybe some high rise housing, open space. But actually, the other thing I have to say is this. New York City has rent stabilization laws, and those laws remain in effect as long as New York City-wide rental housing vacancy remains below 5%. And the law says as long as the rental vacancy is less than 5%, that constitutes a housing emergency. So I think the more important issue is really figuring out how much housing the city could start to add that really makes a dent in the neighborhood vacancy rates.
So instead of 30-story buildings, 15-story buildings would probably be a good baseline to start. And even using that, we are able to fit about 19,000 apartments and about 71,000 people here. Now, with that many people, what about subway capacity? North Conduit and Aqueduct Racetrack are extremely underused stations, each seeing about 550 riders daily in 2023. The ridership is so low that in the Rockaway Beach Branch study, the MTA wanted to close one of them down. However, add 71,000 residents into Aqueduct and you flip the script completely. Close to 29,000 riders would use the Aqueduct stations daily. 29,000 riders seems high, but not everyone is taking the subways at the exact same time. Once again, peak ridership is usually around 10% of total ridership, which means this new development at Aqueduct would at most add 2,900 riders per hour onto the A. Now, according to the MTA's ridership analysis, in 2014, the A was at 73% capacity, with 18,000 riders per hour. Adding 2,900 riders would make it around 21,000 riders per hour, which would make the A run at 84% capacity. This means that the subway infrastructure here can take the equivalent of a tiny city and be just fine. One station south of Aqueduct is Howard Beach. And just like Aqueduct, Howard Beach has a ton of parking lots near it. But unlike Aqueduct, Howard Beach is moderately used, at about 2,500 riders daily. That is thanks mostly to JFK International Airport nearby. But outside the airport, there isn't much near Howard Beach other than a massive pile of parking lots. And the parking lot here is about the same size seen as Aqueduct, if not bigger, at about 2.8 million square feet. However, these parking lots, although sometimes empty, do serve as parking space for JFK. And JFK does make good money off of that, at about $500 million annually. So we are probably going to go for a raised building design to preserve that parking space. But I am not opposed to the idea of a mega parking garage nearby and converting the rest of the land into housing. Anyway, with 2.8 million square feet, using our 15-story building baseline, that comes out to 19,500 apartment units and about 74,000 residents, on par with the mega development site proposed for Aqueduct. This also means that with just 2 subway stations, we added the population equivalent of Stamford, Connecticut. But what about subway capacity? Well, about 32,000 riders would use Howard Beach. Could the A take it? Again, using the peak capacity model, it means we are adding at most 3,200 riders in the peak direction. This would put the A train at 97% capacity, which means now the A could take the equivalent of another small US city and be fine. Also remember that we are nowhere near 2014 ridership, and not everyone is going to take the A into Manhattan. Some might take it to the Rockaways. Some might take it to Broadway Junction and transfer to other Brooklyn lines. Though in the future, we should reactivate a certain abandoned rail line in the center of Queens in order to expand neighborhood access to the rest of the borough. Because I don't know about you, but the Q52 and Q53 will never be enough to carry this many people to northern Queens. These buses can barely do it now. What makes you think they could do more? And I certainly do not think a Walmart High Line would be sufficient either. In fact, this Walmart High Line should have been relegated to the ash heap of history, and it's the dumbest. Shifting gears into Brooklyn, there aren't as many giant parking lots. That is because Brooklyn was developed before the car. You get some truly dense neighborhoods. However, there are a few places that lag behind the rest of the borough. Take the Gowanus Canal. It is an area that is extremely sparsely populated. A combination of empty lots and some low-rise buildings dot the area. And the city does want to redevelop the area, adding about 5,000 new apartments and about 19,000 new residents here. The F train here is extremely underused, only running at 71% capacity in 2014. Adding 1,900 riders per hour will boost it to 81%, which means we are still far from the trains being full. This is great, but because the Gowanus Canal is still an industrial area, I do want to take a different approach to the new housing, as industrial areas are still vital to the health of the city.
The corridor has a lot of manufacturing, one-story like retail, industry, parking too, but yeah, a lot of basically low-floor industry. There is the risk that we could run of displacing business, but I chose one floor in particular because it is pretty trivial to build on top of stuff. We have horizontal space, but we also have vertical space. We could add the manufacturing building and then put housing on top and then keep the retail from going under.
With these changes, you preserve local industry in the area, plus making space for desperately needed housing. It is a win-win. Finally, the F train south of Church Avenue would be a place I recommend for upzoning.
A lot of South Brooklyn is zoned for R2 or R3 stuff that's like pretty low capacity. And in terms of taking advantage of the subway capacity that we have right now, there's definitely a lot of room to improve.
This section of the line is notorious for being underutilized. I mean, look at the ridership. A typical station here sees a quarter of the ridership of its station up north. It is no wonder that trains empty out after Church Avenue. Furthermore, when CBTC is completed on Culver and QBL, it is likely that even more F trains would run out to Culver. We then get a problem. One side is crush loaded, the other side is empty. You can short-turn more trains at Kings Highway, but even short-turning them isn't enough, as even with 10-minute frequencies, the F train could still be extremely underfull. The solution would therefore be upzone everything.
It doesn't have to go from one family and two family houses to massive apartment buildings, but there should be a significant upzoning that allows apartment buildings, could be 5 to 10-story apartment buildings or something like that. That's what make a lot more economic sense, would help the housing affordability shortage, and also help the subway increase ridership.
Keeping in mind the new developments at the Gowanus Canal, the F train would start around 81% full. This means that there is an excess of 3,831 people per hour, and we could therefore add 38,000 extra residents and about 10,000 apartment units to Culver. And that is just the start. Remember that the ridership is way down compared to 2014, so that the 38,000 resident figure can be even higher. And also remember that by doing the F&M swap and running more F Express service, we can take advantage of CBTC and run even more trains. This means we have the capacity to add tens of thousands of more apartment units beyond our initial 10K. In this video, I proposed the addition of around 72,500 apartments with just the subway capacity we have now on the A, F, M, and R trains. That isn't to mention the tens of thousands of other units I am proposing to add in Midtown Manhattan, where subway capacity empties out. While what I propose is only about 15 to 25% of what is actually needed, the truth is that there's still a ton of capacity left over in our system. Not to mention, this doesn't account for what CBTC and de-interlining can do to the New York City subway, as that will open up even more capacity to our subway system. We can then use this capacity to expand housing there. We just need to do it intelligently. Anyway, this marks the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.